Okay.
I'll just quickly introduce you and then you can.
All right.
So welcome everybody to this meeting of the Vegan Studies Network Research Seminar. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Wrenn, who is a lecturer in sociology and co-director of the Center for the Study of Social and Political Movements at the University of Kent. Cobbe is very active in vegan research as well as outreach. She founded the Vegan Feminist Network in 2013 and co-founded the International Association of Vegan Sociologists in 2020. Her research builds on social movement theory to explore relationships between humans and other animals and animal liberation efforts. She has published widely on animals and veganism, and besides her many articles, I'd like to mention her 3 books: A Rational Approach to Animal Rights in 2016, Piecemeal Protest, Animal Rights in the Age of Nonprofits in 2020, and the latest one, about which we're going to hear more today, is Animals in Irish Society, Interspecies Oppression and Vegan Liberation in Britain's First Colony, which was published in 2021. I'm recording the talk, which will be on our YouTube channel, and you can find it just by Googling Vegan Studies Network YouTube, but we'll stop recording after the talk, so you can feel free to ask questions during the Q&A. Cobbe, you're very, very welcome.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to have another opportunity to talk about my new book, which is a long process. So this is really great to be able to share the fruits of all of that labor. I actually started this book in 2017, so it was some time ago. Let me also make a couple more introductions as they're in the screen. This is Mishka. Mishka's deaf, so she's just kind of here to see what's going on. And then that's Keeley Jr. in the back, who does sometimes chat, so we'll see. So in this talk, I just wanted to introduce folks to what I find a very interesting but largely overlooked and sometimes forgotten history to the animal rights movement, that being what has happened in Ireland. And it's not just animal rights activism, but I also want to talk about what Ireland actually can contribute to the critical study of animals and animals in society. So oftentimes in the history books, or the animal rights history books anyway, we tend to focus on the United States or the United Kingdom, and we kind of lose sight of the island in between, which actually has had a major impact on many aspects of animal rights activism, but also has so much to tell us especially now that we are seeing a post-colonial turn in critical animal studies. It has so much to tell us about the relationship between humans and other animals, and how that oppression is very much so entangled. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of Ireland. Obviously, it's many hundreds of years. I can't go into too much detail, but I wanted to give you a bit of an overview just so you can see some of or just get you thinking, I guess, to spark some imagination about some interesting intersections. And also towards the end of this talk, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail into how non-human animal oppression today in Ireland has been really relevant to the making of the Irish state, because Ireland is now on its centennial. It's been a nation state for 100 years. So how did non-human animals kind of figure into that? And at the end of this, I'm going to be looking at a little bit of how, in contemporary times, how Irish media has understood the rise of veganism and animal rights. So that last bit is not so much covered in the book. This is something that's a little bit of an addendum. So there will be, something new, at least in this talk, if you're going to pick up the book. All right. So I think if we're in the Vegan Studies Network here, or in the audience, I think a lot of folks are probably a little bit more familiar with most about the history of animal rights. But I'm going to introduce a few key characters and see if any of these names ring a bell. And if some of them do, I'm wondering did you know that they had connections to Ireland? So this guy, Richard Martin, is kind of credited for being one of the first politicians to be able to push animal welfare legislation in the UK. And that was with the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act in 1822. And that was a long process in the making, and he did try to do additional policies after that. But this was really the first one in Western history that had a major impact as far as, finally legitimizing concern about animal welfare. And it also went on to spur the formation of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But what I think a lot of people don't know about Richard Martin, and by the way, his nickname was Humanity Dick because he wasn't just interested in animal rights and animal welfare, he was also engaged in a lot of other social causes of the era. But what I think a lot of folks don't know is that he was in Galway. He lived in Galway. And so he actually was living in Ireland when a lot of this work was being done. So there was a very much so very deep connection to Ireland when the very first animal rights legislation was taking place. And that image right there, he did get a lot of pushback for his humanity work for non-human animals. He was known to, he was compassionate about it. He would sometimes intervene on people who were violating the act and offer to pay the fines for them, and just as an educational moment. But sometimes he would even bring this to court. And in this painting, he's being mocked, unfortunately. But he brought a donkey into court to demonstrate how horrible this donkey had been treated. So this, of course, was in the early 1800s in Great Britain, was kind of seen as not taken very seriously. But this was really the turning point when we first have legislation that's starting to recognize non-human animals, not just as things, but as sentient beings. So an MP from Galway. Now, I bet no one has heard of William Drummond. William Drummond is kind of known in Irish culture and Irish history as being a naturalist. But in fact, he was one of the first people, not just first Irish people, but first people to publish a book on animal rights. He originally submitted this as an essay, or was planning to submit this as an essay to an essay contest for the very new SPCA, but he missed the deadline. But his colleagues said, this is so great, you should publish it as a book, which he did. And it had ramifications, it had a big impact. So William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, the very famous American abolitionist, met William Drummond and had a correspondence with him. And he handed him a copy of The Rights of Animals. And if you look at some of the notes from William Lloyd Garrison, too many Williams, you can actually see in his notes, he uses exclamation marks and capital letters. He's so intellectually just really excited and turned on by this idea of not just fighting for human rights, but also for animal rights. Frances Power Cobbe, some folks might be familiar with her. She was Anglo-Irish, and she really was one of a powerhouse in the late Victorian era, because she was very much so foundational for a lot of the anti-vivisection campaigning. She wrote essay after essay in books, and she procured illustrations of what happened in laboratories, what happened in medical institutions. She fought tirelessly to end vivisection. Originally, she had worked to kind of create some of the first legislation against vivisection. The idea being that because it was kind of the wild, wild west back then as far as animal testing. And she figured if we create this act, it will make it very, very difficult for practitioners to procure animals and to conduct tests on them. Unfortunately, what happened was it gave the industry, gave the institution a veneer of legitimacy. And that really pissed her off. And so what she ended up doing was forming another anti-vivisection organization that was explicitly abolitionist. So that was the British Union Against Vivisection, something like that. But today it's still around. It's known as Cruelty Free International. The first one that she founded was the National Anti-Vivisection Society, which also is still around. So she was very much so influential in raising attention to this horror of vivisection, creating one of the first animal rights acts, and actually founding two of the most important anti-vivisection and animal rights organizations, which are still around today. So she was another Irish woman. Another woman that I bet a lot of folks have never heard of before, Charlotte Despard. She was another Anglo-Irish. I think a lot of her family were actually Irish, but she lived in Scotland. And she was one of those people who was just deeply, deeply engaged in all sorts of human rights causes, but also animal rights issues. So she was a member of the Vegetarian Society, president of the Vegetarian Society. She was very much so involved with a lot of anti-vivisection. So for instance, the brown dog protests of the early 1900s, she led that campaign to get a statue placed in Battersea so that folks could be aware of what was happening to non-human animals. And she strategically chose that area because it was basically the slums of London at that time. And there were a lot of Irish nationalists there who were very much so aware of the violence of the British state on Irish people. There was a lot of suffragette activism happening there. And so, in fact, when they would have meetings to discuss the campaign, there's notes that they had Irish nationalists who would actually police these meetings, because what ended up happening was a lot of medical students kind of swarmed down and started to protest this statue because they saw it as a threat to their privilege. So unfortunately, after a lot of back and forth, and also, by the way, there was an animal hospital that was located there, and that became a target as well from these counter protesters. But unfortunately, after a lot of back and forth, the protests and the counter protests, the city was like, listen, we can't afford to police this anymore. So this is going to have to go, or else you have to fund your own policing. And as a poor area of London, they just couldn't afford to do so. So that was taken down. A few days later, they ended up in Trafalgar Square, where they were giving a lot of speeches about vivisection. And at that time, it was the biggest animal rights protest to date. And again, an Irish woman was behind that. Super cool. Another super awesome guy who's been completely, I think, forgotten from history is Jack McClelland. Jack McClelland was from Belfast. He was a Northern Irish guy, and he was very active in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as basically an all-around athlete. And he was our first, I guess, modern day, certainly in Ireland, celebrity vegan athlete. And he would do all these amazing feats like swim the Galway Bay or swim these like major bodies of water. And people would come from everywhere, all over Ireland, to watch him, not really knowing necessarily that he was vegan, but just appreciating these amazing stunts that he could do. But he wasn't just an athlete, he was very much so an activist. And so one of the first things that he did was he was using his body to test, so like as an experiment. So he would eat a lot of seaweed, which is, of course, a very stereotypical traditional Irish food. And he would test different diets to see how that would increase his stamina. And he was a very active member of the Vegan Society. He was an active member of the International Vegetarian Union. Also, he ran the Ulster Vegetarian Society, and he had a chain of health food stores. So he was really an all-around kind of hero. And unfortunately, I feel like he's really, I didn't know about him until I started doing research for this. He's mentioned quite a bit in the old issues of the Vegan for the Vegan Society, but outside of that, I don't really hear about him. And even if you go on Google, you won't find too much about him. But one of our very first vegan celebrities, not just vegan because of his diet, but vegan because of his activism. Another kind of era of forgotten Irish activism is in the era of direct action in the 80s and the 90s and beyond. And unfortunately, in my book, I was not able to find a lot of evidence of this. I found some, but not terribly a lot of it. And since the book published, I actually had a colleague reach out to me, Mark Fitzpatrick, who was a part of that era, and he has documented quite a lot of that. And so I have linked it down here at the bottom, thehumanitytrigger.com, and you can see a lot of the newspaper coverage and the correspondence between activists. And so that bit was so lost from history that even when I was actively looking for it, I couldn't find any. So yeah, there's a whole lot of this amazing Irish vegan and animal rights activism that I think is really, really worth celebrating, because again, Ireland tends to be forgotten in the animal rights history, but also Ireland is a colonial space. And I think that that has a lot to do with the fact that we don't recognize what happened in Ireland or what happens in Ireland. And there's a bit of this kind of colonial stereotyping that continues, whether we're conscious or not. So it's really worth kind of revisiting that history. So that's just kind of get the water warmed up, talking about these like cool, amazing things that people have done. But now I want to take it back and talk a little bit more about the roots of oppression in Ireland. So I'm very clear in the book that this is not just a story of, you know, downtrodden Ireland, but also there's a lot of amazing resistance that happened as well. So that's why I wanted to start off with some of the positive stuff before I go into the more negative colonial structural roots of oppression that happened there. So again, Ireland has a very, very long history, and it's very rich and diverse, and it's very difficult to cram it into a PowerPoint. But one thing we do know for sure is that early Irish society was very much so animist, as many traditional cultures were. And what that meant was that although it was not some kind of utopia by any means, we do know that non-human animals were given a little bit more status than they have today. So they were almost seen as community members or neighbors. They were respected in a lot of ways. Hunting was not a big thing in early Ireland. Yes, some hunting did take place, but it was more of a status thing, because when people came to Ireland, they brought domesticated animals with them. So that was really the main use of non-human animals, was through cattle keeping. And in fact, it was a cattle culture, and so many Irish names, places, the language, Irish language has the language of cows kind of embedded in it. The landscape as well has been shaped by that cattle culture. But one thing that I think is a big myth about early Irish society is that people were just like chowing down on meat all day long. That really wasn't the case, because with many traditional societies, animals are better, more profitable or more useful when they are alive. So especially for a cattle culture, it was much more vegetarian diet. Animals would not be killed unless they were older. And so you're chilling out here. So it was more of a milk, butter, and cheese type of society, not so much a beef society. So it was much more plant-based than we like to think. And this, of course, is based on archaeological research. A lot of archaeological research focuses on his really important sites, gathering sites where there would have been a lot of feasting. And that kind of gives a skewed idea that, oh, people must have been eating a lot of meat because look at all the animal bones. But those tended to be on major feast days or other celebrations and gatherings. In the average diet, which they can tell by analyzing the old pots and cooking spaces, it was much more plant-based. So yeah, cows are a major part of the economy, and it wasn't just that humans lived with these other animals. They really were foundational to the economy, to their politics, and to their culture. As I said, so much of the culture, language, names, place names have been shaped by cows, but also the landscape. There's thousands of these old ring forts that still exist in Ireland, and there's lots of theories about what those might be. One of them is that they were used to pin animals. So that 1,000 years later, we still have these old formations of that old, thousands of years old cattle society. But another legacy from thousands of years ago, and Ireland, by the way, was populated by humans, we think 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. But another legacy from those bygone times is actually in the physical bodies of Irish people, because the global majority cannot digest lactose after weaning. But when people entered Ireland, which was a much cooler climate, and fruits and vegetables might not have been able to be grown as much throughout the year, people started to adjust genetically and very quickly to being able to rely on animal proteins, so animal breast milk. So even in the bodies of Irish people, it's been shaped by that early cow culture, which remains today. So the argument I'm making is not that Irish people back then were vegan, but I'm saying that they were a lot closer to vegan than what we typically think that they would have been. So they were much more plant-based, and we did not see a shift. We did not see the shift to a much heavier meat and dairy-based economy in Ireland until colonialism under the Normans, but especially under Britain. When that happened, it was a major shift toward all of these resources, land. People moved out of the way in order to produce copious amounts. And because that's when we have a beef economy, when we have a beef and dairy economy, it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of land. And so under colonization, Ireland basically became an outsourced feedlot. And so people were being pushed off their land, they've been made into tenants. So the privatization of land, so of course, colonization and capitalism kind of go hand in hand here. And when you have people pushed off their land, they become quite vulnerable. And they also become quite food insecure. So all the resources are being put into producing beef and dairy to feed industrializing England, but also the slave trade. So a lot of Irish meat would be shipped into the Caribbean and the Americas to feed the slave trade there. And so now folks who were left back in Ireland could not have that varied diet that they once had. And if you look at the archaeological records, and a lot of this is documented in my book, it's a hugely diverse, rich diet that folks had. Hazelnuts, fruits, vegetables, wild growing plants, mushrooms, seaweeds, I could go on and on. But by the time colonialism hits, people don't have access to that land anymore. And so what happens is that people start to grow potatoes, which can grow in the crappiest of soil that's not suitable for other large scale farming. They rely a lot on cabbage. And it's been said that in the leaner times of the year, of course, cabbages and potatoes keep a little bit longer, but when people only had cabbage to eat, like their skin, like this is reported in some of the ethnographic accounts, that people's skin would actually start to turn green because they were just living off of cabbages. So it was a high food security under British colonization. And so that rich, diverse plant-based diet that was really indigenous to Gaelic society became replaced with a vegetarianism of paucity, of precariousness, a colonial vegetarianism. Now, this relationship between food, non-human animals, and Irish oppression was not lost on a lot of the campaigners for home rule and for independence from England. Many of the nationalists, not all, but quite a few of them recognized that animal agriculture was really central to a lot of this suffering. Some of them actually did advocate for vegetarianism. Some of them believed and said, if we actually can stop our reliance on non-human animals, we can really free up a lot of land and resources for humans. We can also improve the diet of humans. So there was a lot of vegetarian activism happening in the United States and in Great Britain more broadly. So of course, there was also folks in Ireland who were able to apply that to the colonial setting. Unfortunately, when Ireland did become free, they didn't take that route. They actually doubled down on animal agriculture, but there was a lot of, before that time, that very heady time when the uprising was happening and people were plotting about how we're actually going to understand a free Ireland. There was a lot of vegetarianism, those politics were imbrued in that. So this is an era that not just in Ireland, but in the United States and in England and beyond, people saw these as very intersectional issues. So colonialism and vegetarianism, these are not foreign people. It was not a foreign idea to compare the two things. And in fact, a lot of the home rule agitation took place in vegetarian restaurants in Dublin. And this is a little known fact, but the proclamation rather, for free Ireland was actually signed in one woman's vegetarian restaurant. So this was also not lost on people, the connection here, because one of the nasty ways that the colonizers and nativists in the United States, by the way, where a lot of these people, Irish people were fleeing. They were fleeing to the United States in droves because there was no way to make a living or to survive, especially during the famine in Ireland for a lot of people. But one of the nasty ways that this oppression could be normalized was by animalizing Irish humans. So if you look at some of the popular magazines and publications and periodicals in American newspapers and in British newspapers, you see this trope used over and over again of Irish people depicted as apes. And indeed, you can also look at some of the scientific documents where the Celtic race was believed to be a missing link between fully developed civilized European humans and just straight up monkeys and apes. And they were actually described as being physically different and actually having darker skin. They were not considered to be white people. And this actually went on until the 1930s or so. There was a Harvard study where this is actually after Ireland was free, but there was this notion of that the Celtic people were some kind of distinct race, and there was an effort to kind of distinguish them as superior in some ways. So it's kind of a reversal, an attempt to like over-humanize. And so even in the 1930s, a Harvard study went to Ireland and started measuring thousands of Irish people to see if they were a distinctive race, which of course they're just, white Europeans like anybody else. But anyway, that animalization was very potent. We have to think about that kind of context in today's vegan Irish politics as well, that animalization of people. And we know in critical animal studies that animalization happens in many other parts of the world, especially in colonized regions. So, like I said, after Ireland goes free, rather than uproot speciesism, which was so important for oppressing Ireland, they unfortunately decide to double down on that. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be. One of them might be, I think, by doubling down on speciesism, that by comparison, shows that Irish people are humans, because in a post-colonial society, humanization, to be human, humanity is oftentimes enacted by oppressing other animals, right? And like really aggravating that binary and taking that position of privilege and domination. That shows that you're a human. That might be part of it. It also may be because for hundreds of years, Ireland had been kind of put on this pathway of dependency with animal agriculture, and it just seemed the most logical kind of route. So also there was a lot of conservatism in early free Ireland, where it was a hope that they would be completely independent and not dependent on other countries. And so it was quite conservative at that time. And they were hoping to have a competitive edge in the capitalist world system, and using meat and dairy seemed one way to do that. So we see a huge expansion. So even after colonialism is over, a huge expansion in reliance on non-human animals. So while there was only 1.8 million cows alive at the height of British colonialism during the Great Famine, today we see many times that with over 6 million cows. So it's a major part of the Irish economy today. It's one of the biggest producers of meat and dairy. 1/3 of the food and drink exports from Ireland, it's actually coming from non-human animals. And also we have to keep in mind larger political context here. Ireland is a member of the EU, and the EU, despite knowing that animal agriculture is a major contributor to climate change, continues to subsidize animal agriculture. And so this is definitely keeping this Irish reliance on meat and dairy afloat, because it's definitely not a very profitable industry. A lot of the farmers are really suffering. They're losing their family lands and so on. You want to get down? Okay, goodbye. And certainly Ireland, because it's one of the biggest producers of animal agriculture, every year it exceeds its emissions cap. And so we have this bizarre situation where the EU is saying, okay, we need to get climate change under control. And then with the other hand, funnels millions and millions of euros into countries like Ireland to keep animal agriculture afloat. There's also, of course, this legacy of Irish farming as being very important to sustaining Irish people, and especially before independence, but absolutely after. So Irish farmers can kind of have this very romantic and very important role in Irish society. And so challenging that becomes really problematic. There's this farmer tradition and family heritage, Irish mammy. So remember, after independence was a very conservative time. Before independence, the politics of Irish nationalism were quite radical, very feminist. There's vegetarianism associated with that. But after that freedom, we actually see just kind of a curtain of conservatism that falls down. So if folks aren't aware, there was very limited women's rights. Divorce actually is not legal in Ireland until very recently. Abortion was not legal in Ireland until very recently. And so it's a very Marianistic sort of society. And you can see this in some of the early dairy ads, where women are kind of conflated with non-human animals, and feeding and sustaining and nurturing and mothering the Ireland. So Ireland actually becomes a sort of mother island figure as well. Now, and more up to date, we also see this kind of relationship with animality used to actually otherize people who are not Irish. Ireland is one of the most white countries in the world. It's something like 94% white people. And so that you can imagine that sets it up for some problems when we're looking at how animalization might be, or relationships with animals might be used to otherize. So for instance, like many other countries in the West, Ireland sustains its animal agriculture by shipping out live export of non-human animals like cows or sheep. And we've also seen this with other countries like Australia, but when those animals go to other places, and those other places tend to be places where brown people live and with different religious backgrounds, there's been a lot of protests about how Muslim people treat their animals. And then this assumption, well, Irish people are more superior, more human-like, more civilized. And remember, it's very important that in a context where Ireland has been treated as otherwise, or Irish people have been treated as otherwise, it seems like there might be a context there and an incentive for Irish campaigners to really double down and say, actually, we are more human-like because we treat our animals more humanely than those other places brown people and non-Christian people. But even within Ireland, we see a lot of that animalization and otherization and the kind of politicization of animal cruelty. So travelers, the traveling community in Ireland is a little bit different from the traveling communities elsewhere in the world. They've recently been recognized as an ethnically distinct group within Ireland, but they're genetically Irish people for the most part. They're not Roma travelers. So there's a lot of theories about where travelers came from in Ireland, or how this ethnicity kind of emerged, but that's kind of neither here nor there. What we know is that by the famine times, there was a lot of people who had no land, and so they became itinerant. And so they would travel around in horse-drawn kind of caravans, making do with whatever work that they could get. And traveling people persist today. They're extremely oppressed people. There's a lot of discrimination there. There's been a history where traveling people who've been excluded, but also it's kind of part of the culture not to get education beyond a certain point. There's a lot of poverty. Suicide rates are really high. One of the things that travelers do that's a major part of their culture is horses. As I said, horses were part of like drawing the caravans. They were a major part of the economy. Travelers were big in the selling and buying of horses. They were also involved in the knackering business, so buying horses and then taking them to slaughter. And so travelers have done a lot of kind of the dirty work as well in society. And so unfortunately, what has happened is that after Ireland became a free state, the travelers became sort of a sore spot on Ireland. Like, look at these people who eschew capitalism, they eschew private property, they eschew education, they eschew settling in a place. And so they become these sort of non-civilized, non-human types of people. Now you compare that with the horse culture that they have, where travelers oftentimes have festivals or gatherings where horses are bartered, sold, and traded. They also have the horse racing, and oftentimes that horse racing, and all horse racing is problematic and cruel, but because travelers are doing it, they tend to get a lot more of the spotlight on them. Ireland has a huge horse racing industry, by the way, and the government dumps tons and tons of euros into it every year. But what gets the attention is not the mainstream settled horse racing industry, it's what the travelers are doing. And so there's a lot of laws that have been put into place to keep them out of communal lands, and also to clamp down on horse racing, which they call sulky racing. And if you ever visit Ireland, you'll see them in tourist areas. But again, this is kind of language of animalization and otherization. Once Ireland has become free and independent, it's very concerned with, consciously or not, appearing civilized. And so travelers had to be controlled because they kind of represented that otherness, that uncivilizedness that they wanted to move away from. And we also see this fear, this kind of anxiety about being civilized or appearing civilized, and i.e. human, in some of the current pushback against veganism. And if you follow the work of Sandra Higgins, who runs Go Vegan World, which is based in County Meath, a lot of the interviews that she has and debates that she has with people in the animal industry I find very, very revealing. So, and a lot of the pushback, and first off, I will say this, is that Irish media does tend to be a little bit more interested in these debates than I would say in the United States, definitely the United States, and maybe a little bit more than also in the UK. But there's also a lot of kind of pushback on that. And so at the National Dairy Council on the Pat Kenny show, when pushed about this vegan issue, oh, well, it would create this massive nutrient deficit and people would have to be this widespread public health issue. Now, we have a history in Ireland, of course, of multiple, and the Great Famine was only one of many famines, by the way. There's multiple famines reaching all the way back through British colonization. But this kind of fear of people were degraded and seen as lesser than and powerless because they couldn't eat meat like the colonizers did. And so we see that along the board when states become free and they're no longer colonized, they double down on their animal agriculture and their animal consumption. So India is another example of that. We're also seeing that in China. And there's also been some people who've responded in some of these debates that I've watched with Sandra Higgins saying that, well, the famine also is a lesson to why we can't rely on vegetables. But in fact, it was these vegetables, and if it weren't for the potato, we actually would have had a lot more starvation. It just so happened that because there was a reliance on the potato, that singular crop, that when a blight happened, it really put people in trouble. But if it weren't for the potato sustaining people for the years before and after that famine, then we'd have a lot more starvation, actually. So potatoes were introduced as a measure of some kind of sustenance for people who'd been so exploited that there was hunger and malnutrition anyway. But that legacy, that fear, that collective trauma of the famine or the famines has actually been used by some people I've seen to kind of push back on veganism as being too vulnerable to to risks. There's also some evidence people are worried that veganism is portraying climate change as this major problem. And because animal agriculture is so vital to Irish economy, some people push back on that and say that climate change is, they're saying it's a hoax. And I've seen some coverage of this in the Irish Times, where they have conferences about this, trying to push back on this idea of plant-based food being more sustainable and climate change being a true threat. So that brings us to today. And I'm very pleased to say that despite stereotypes about Irish society being very backwards or super conservative, that's really not the case in modern Ireland. And that's really where the spark for writing this book came from, because way back in the 2015, 2014, when I started visiting Ireland, I was in the United States, and I was talking to, I was at a bar actually with my brother, and I was talking about this trip I was about to take to Ireland, and he knew I was a vegan. He says, "How are you going to eat in Ireland? It's just the land of meat and potatoes." But I knew because I spent a lot of time in Ireland, that's not the case. Like, my partner at the time was vegan, and there's vegan restaurants all over. Well, not all over, but they existed. We could go into a grocery store and buy vegan alternatives easily. It wasn't a big issue. So there's a stereotype about Ireland being very anti-vegan or kind of backwards, but that's not the case. And if you look at coverage in the Irish Times, it's very exciting. You see this big spike now, and where we have front page or not front page, but main stories in the Irish Times about plant-based eating, about offering advice on transitioning, offering recipes, highlighting new restaurants or new cookbooks. And so veganism now is kind of, dare I say, a normal part of the Irish, at least mediascape, certainly in culture. Looking at how Irish people have been Googling, you also see a steady increase over the recent years in interest in veganism. That said, this needs to be put in the context of veganism is still a major threat to the state. It's a major threat to the economy. It poses a political threat, and therefore Irish media, Irish culture, at least, certainly media, has to grapple with the fact of, okay, this is becoming more popular. It's not going anywhere, but also it's a threat. So when we're looking at major newspapers, of course, are not independently funded. They're funded by major corporations and advertisers and things like that. So they have to be a little bit careful about how they frame these radical messages. And I've done other work in British newspapers and found that similar trends are happening. But just looking in Ireland, one of the ways that veganism can be covered and given its kind of cultural due, but also dampening it, is by presenting veganism as some kind of sideshow. So I think Roger Yates is here, and he can probably offer, he's done a little bit more research on this woman. One of the earliest mentions of veganism in just mainstream press was this woman, what's her name? Moira, I forget her last name, but Roger can, yeah, Moira Henry. But she's interviewed in this early 1949 issue of the Irish Times. And this, by the way, is only 5 years after the Vegan Society had been formed. She talks about what it's like to be vegan in Ireland. And by titling it, as you can see at the top, hopefully, if my video is not covering it up, but the title of the story is "The Only Vegan in Ireland." It's like this amazing sideshow act, like, come and see the vegan. But also the happy pair. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the happy pair. They're an Irish identical twins. And I don't think they're really vegan for animal rights reasons per se, but they're definitely into whole foods, healthy eating. And I think they had I don't know if they had a television show, but they have restaurants and they have a product line. And they're like, I see them in all kinds of different media spaces. But they're a bit, to be fair, they're a bit goofy. They're a bit off. I don't know how to describe them. But when people do interviews with them, you can definitely get a sense that they're not quite being taken seriously. And the fact, of course, that they're identical twins, people are always like, ooh, obsessed with that. But if you also look at Jack McClelland, who I mentioned earlier, he was certainly a spectacle. He was certainly something that people went to go see, and it was like a carnival-like affair. If you can find some of the early footage, people would have set up food trucks, and there would be kids running around and like fun things to do while they're waiting on this great swim to happen or whatever it may be. So this is veganism as a sideshow. This is not veganism as a threatening political movement by any means. However, one of the things we do see in Irish media is explicitly recognizing veganism as a threat. And so sometimes when veganism is mentioned in the mainstream media, it will be quickly juxtaposed with animal agriculture. So they'll immediately run over to the Dairy Council and say, what do you think about this? And that will be presented as the authority. So, okay, the journalists will say, okay, we found this wonky vegan message out there, or this vegan event that's happening. Like, it's not really been taken seriously. So they go and they say, okay, let's talk to the beef people, let's talk to the dairy people and see what they think about this. And the way oftentimes that these interviews and newspaper articles are framed, it positions veganism as the threat and something that should not be taken seriously. And it brings in the authority of the meat and dairy industry or the dietetic folks to kind of sort it all out. So the reader is definitely left with this idea of like veganism, well, be careful there. So Irish farmers also, they tend to get, because of that beloved sort of cultural history that they have. And to be fair, Irish farmers, sustained the country during some really terrible times, and sustained the country during the very tumultuous time of shifting to a free state. But they continue to have this kind of romantic space in the Irish kind of imagination where they're presented as authentic Ireland. Of course, like this picture I found off Google somewhere, like people who aren't Irish, like that's what we think of when we think of Ireland, is the old guy walking the fields with his shepherd dog, and that's seen as real Ireland. And so they get this position of authority, and they're the ones that are granted legitimacy. And another interesting example of how that becomes the authority, and then veganism is kind of pushed away as a threat, is when Sandra Higgins' Go Vegan World was trying to one of her big campaigns. It's really a smart one, I think, is she gets ads and she puts them on billboards all over the country. She gets ads in newspapers, she puts ads on buses. But at one point, Dublin Bus and Irish Rail actually said, we won't take your ads because they're overtly emotive and provocative. Basically, showing what really, and by the way, very, very few of her campaigns show any kind of animal suffering. They just show animals being animals, like a mother cow with a baby calf, and says, dairy disrupts family or something like that. So they're not really that provocative compared to what some of the other stuff that comes out of the animal rights movement looks like. But they're considered, a threat. And also the Dairy Council has kind of dismisses them as being influencers. So if you look at some of the reports that they come out with, and of course, influencers is a little bit gendered, but the idea here is that these are influencers. These are not credible people. They're brainwashing young people and brainwashing our culture. And so they should be, they're a threat that needs to be kind of pushed aside. I also have to talk about terrorism because we do live in a post 9/11 society. And after 9/11, that had major ramifications for animal rights activism in the UK, in Ireland, and in the United States, and Canada, and probably elsewhere in the world. So now, because animal agriculture is such a major part of the Irish state and the Irish economy and Irish politics, that if you're interfering with that, that necessarily puts you in a sort of terroristic sort of space. So in the United States, we have a law on the books where in 2006, they changed the Animal Enterprise Protection Act to Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And that was done with a lot of lobbying. Roger Yates has also done some work on how the policing and this kind of terrorist sort of culture we live in has influenced Irish animal rights work. But certainly when we're looking at Ireland, we need to be thinking about, when animal agriculture is so important to the nation state, what happens when people challenge that? So we do have some research elsewhere in other countries that would support that this is going to be an issue in Ireland. I've seen some of the debates with Sandra Higgins about her advertisements, or her campaigns rather, where she's been compared to ISIS. Her campaigns have been depicted as, or described as, militant. So this particular ad that you see here, humane milk is a myth. The dairy industry took all her babies and all her milk. Now it will take her life for meat, leather, and byproducts. She is 6 years old. Her natural lifespan is 25 years. So when this campaign was debated in Irish media, it was described as militant. And one of the people who called in to discuss it, I think it was a radio show, he said, this is like, she's ISIS. But I can't imagine like what is terroristic about this, except maybe there's the barbed wire fence sort of, right? So it can only be understood with the recognition that challenging animal agriculture is to challenge the state. So sometimes this will be sensationalized as well to kind of reframe peaceful protesters as dangerous people who need to be caged up, policed. So there was some protests happening where some activists were, I think, going there and going out in fields and confronting farmers or something like that. I forget now. It's been a while. But in the Irish news, they were depicted as frightening and abusive, when really these are just activists who are trying to raise awareness of what happens to non-human animals and challenge that. I think this is another one that we need to be aware of, and this is probably the most prominent, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but like most one that goes under the radar, and we don't really recognize this as problematic, let's put it that way, is veganism as a diet. And I see this in American news and also in my content analyses of British newspapers as well, is that veganism is discussed openly. Maybe it's not depicted as a threat, maybe it's not sensationalized, whatever it may be, but it's just talking about food. It's not talking about animal rights. It's not talking about politics. It's not talking about speciesism. It's just stuff to consume, which is really what the media is all about, isn't it? Especially newspapers, which are very advertising dependent and very industry dependent. There's an incentive there to push product. And so that's what unfortunately starts to happen to veganism, is it becomes a matter of, these are things to consume. This is a lifestyle. Here's some recipes. Here's some restaurants. Here's some vegan travel ideas. And it has really nothing to do with animal rights politics or climate change in a lot of cases. In fact, I see climate change, although very rarely discussed in terms and linked up with veganism, it's far more discussed than when we see veganism in the newspapers linked up with animals. I just finished a content analysis of British newspapers, and there was about 400 articles that I coded. Only one of those out of 400 actually spotlighted animal rights issues for animal rights reasons. Almost, I think, over half of the rest of them were about just vegan food stuff to buy. And so it's just this kind of capitalist consumerist stuff. And so really depoliticizes it, defangs it. We also see that a lot of this is about kind of an interesting flip from where Ireland was that sort of colonial, mysterious space. Now veganism has kind of become that exotic, non-Irish thing out there. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of the staples of vegan cuisine and vegan culture, vegan subculture, things like falafel, tofu, seitan, things that come from elsewhere in the world. When in fact, we have a lot of food in Ireland that is historically and traditionally Irish. But in a lot of the media, in Irish media, veganism is portrayed as kind of this, this exotic kind of fetishistic thing that we can consume and purchase. I will say that there is some Irish media that is recognizing, because this is a big part of Irish food culture in recent decades, is to celebrate grown in Ireland, produced in Ireland. And there's a lot of packaging. If you go visit, if you are Irish, you know this, but if you're not Irish, if you visit Ireland, go to the grocery stores and you'll see big part of the campaigning in the grocery stores and the advertisements and also in the product labeling is to highlight that this is made in Ireland. And remember, of course, that harkens back to that old colonial heritage. And when Ireland went free and independent, it was hoping to be actually self-sustaining. So purchasing Irish is a major part of Irish culture today, Irish food culture today. So we are seeing a little bit of that with vegan food, where some of the media can be curious about that, celebrating new vegan Irish cuisine. restaurants. Cornucopia in Dublin has been there since 1986. It's almost as old as me. And that's been a major part of this city center Dublin. And there's been other vegetarian and vegan restaurants, and certainly a lot more today. But I think there's a lot of room to really reimagine veganism as something that's indigenous to Ireland. So this I'm coming towards the end of the talk now, and this is where I try to encourage people to be thinking about, when we think about Irish food, it's not just meat and potatoes. If you look at the archaeological research, there's actually a long legacy of all types of delightful foods that people have eaten over time, from nuts, from fruits and berries and seaweeds to hazelnuts is a big part as well. I see a lot of those in the archaeological sites. We think about Irish stew, and we always think about some kind of dead animal floating in that. But what about a nice hearty vegetarian or vegan Irish stew? Oats are a major part of the Irish agriculture, and increasingly we're starting to see even the Irish Food Board is starting to encourage farmers to switch over to oat production, because they see which way the tide is turning, where oat milk is now becoming more and more popular, and oats are useful for lots of other things as well. Seaweed also is a growing industry in Ireland. Mushrooms, I think mushrooms are a bit contentious because the mushroom industry in Ireland is kind of a byproduct of the meat industry because it's grown in a lot of manure. Nonetheless, I think there's a lot of room for us to think about Irish cuisine as not being foreign out there, tempeh and tofu and all the things that are great and wonderful, but seen as non-Irish, when there's so many things to Irish cuisine. And if you go back, I have it on my website, and I could send a link in the chat after I'm finished. But if you go to, I gave a talk to the Little Museum of Dublin last summer about my book, and an Irish chef and historian was on there with me, and he jumped in and just started naming off all these really obscure traditional Irish dishes that are historically vegan. And you also have to think about, I haven't mentioned this, but Ireland has a Catholic history to it, right? And so fasting, doing plant-based vegan fasting is a major part of Irish history, not so much anymore, but for hundreds of years, people would go vegan for huge swaths of time. In fact, there's 2 days in the week. I think it's Friday and Wednesday, and I'm not going to do terrible Irish and try to pronounce that, but in the language of Wednesday and in the language of Friday is a reference to fasting. So it wasn't just during Lent that Irish people went vegan, it was during 2 days of the week as well. So eating plant-based was a religious practice, it was a historical practice based on the geography in which they lived. And now we have a modern Irish vegan cuisine as well. So this can actually be seen, I think that Ireland can actually see veganism as a return, a celebration to this old way of eating that sustained their culture, their peoples for so very long, got them through some very tough times, and can also recognize that meat and dairy that is so ubiquitous in Irish society today is a direct legacy of British colonization. And so we're thinking about food justice. We think a lot about food justice in the United States. For instance, the largest, fastest growing group of vegans in the United States are Black people, because they're recognizing that animal products are a major part of the colonization and enslavement of Black people, and that has a legacy today. I think Ireland could probably learn a lot from that. So I'm going to leave it there. I probably went a little bit too long, but I got really excited. I love this topic. So if you want to follow my work, you can check out my website. I have a podcast about this book. I have several essays. I have some published peer-reviewed journal articles on this topic as well. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. If you want to see more of my dog and cat, I would suggest going to Instagram. And oh, by the way, and my book has recently gone out in paperback now, so it's actually affordable. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.